Morning, Wrecker.
Hey Nick, how you doing?
Doing well. The mic, my mic. This today, I'm going to not yell into my microphone because the last time we did, I listened to myself and I had all this distortion and awful. You're our audio producer. Shouldn't you be more on top of these things and take care of my voice?
I should, but given that you make me do everything here for this podcast, literally everything, you just show up on Zoom
It's
calls
true.
that I
It's
schedule,
awful.
and then you dare to criticize me. Like I'm not good at these things. I should have a professional producer or whatever. Anyway,
I like that. I like the idea that I just show up, you do everything, and then I criticize you.
and I know why you like that because you're sort of like this. You're the same guy for Youngjin. Youngjin makes you do all sorts of things all the time.
Youngjin is constantly telling me to do things, and I have to do it. But lately, I found out I can tell him to do things, and then he actually does it. But all right, because I think he feels guilty because he had me do so many. So now, if I ask him, I actually asked him, and I asked you as well, to be an associate editor for this CTO track at AOM, and I
Yep,
feel bad because I have way
you
too
should.
few associate editors. So now you're
Well,
gonna
you,
have to.
you asked me whether I can, jump in and be like sort of an exception AE for two papers. I said,
Yeah.
sure, I'll help. And then you gave me seven.
All right.
Seven!
So you're doing it. Young Jin's doing it. Vonda Orlikowski is an associate editor for me. She volunteered. Jennifer Gibbs. I mean, there are some really impressive
But tell you
people
what, like there's some
that
really
are
nice
associate editors.
papers. Like it's really nice papers. Basically, the first or second time I've actually reviewed for AOM, and I looked at five of the seven so far, and they're good.
Yeah.
Like they're not
All right.
all brilliant, but they're nice studies. I
So
like
I'm
it.
the program chair, so I'll do a little commercial here before we get into today's topic. But Academy of Management this year is in Boston. Academy of Management is the world's biggest management conference. They have divisions for strategy, for organizational behavior, for ethics, for critical studies in management. I mean, you name it, right? There's a technology and innovation management group, which is kind of strategy and
Yeah,
it's like
Tim, the
general
Tim
tech.
division. Yep.
And yeah, Tim. And then there's us, which is CTO, which is communications, digital technologies, and organizations. It's kind of the information systems and computational social sciencey kind of division. So I'm program chair. We have people proposing algorithms. We have qualitative ethnographies. I mean, to me, it's the coolest. They're simulations. And we have a whole bunch. And even if you didn't send a paper to AOM, people might consider still going. We have these things called professional development workshops,
They're awesome, by the way. I've ran a
which
few of those. They're brilliant. Like it's a
yeah,
wonderful format just in general.
it's worth going just for them. And some of these
Yeah.
professional development workshops, and we'll put a link to it maybe in our show notes, but these professional development workshops sometimes require that you send an abstract or something like that. So then you get accepted. And then that way you have some acceptance there. Another thing you might do, because we have a lot of junior faculty and doctoral students listening to us, there's a doctoral consortium and a junior faculty consortium. And sometime in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be, and what you do is you apply for that. And it's a really cool thing. It happens before the conference. And you get to network with some celebrities in the field and also some other junior faculty and that sort of thing. So anyway, so that's my AOM commercial.
Well, given that you're doing a commercial, let me throw in a quick one as well. It's not quite the same, biggest conference in the world kind of thing. But this year in the German IS conference, Wirtschaftsinformatik, right? German IS conference.
Wirtschaftsinformatik.
Yeah, it's been running for like God knows how many decades. Anyway, so this year they asked me together with Valerie and Janina to organize the theme track, which is called Digital Responsibility, Social, Ethical, and Ecological Implications of IS, right? It's the theme track for
Oh,
this
wow.
year's conference. Nice and broad, really cool team. And so the deadline will be early March, and the conference will be in September. Now, this is a much smaller conference, although, how big is OCS? Probably, the CTO, sorry, is it like 300 people, I guess?
I think we'll end up with about 300 papers,
Yeah.
yeah, or
Three,
something. But
yeah.
I think it's over 1,000 people in that division. But then the
Oh,
overall
5,000.
conference is going to be over 10,000 attendees,
Yeah, I
right?
know. All right. So the German conference is a lot smaller, but the entire German community is going there, right? It's one of these local conferences, which is quite important in its own right for the region. Anyway, what I wanted to say, so we've also joined to this, not formally joined, but we're also launching a special issue on this very topic. Right, so we are launching a special issue in JAIS, Journal of the AIS, on digital responsibility, social, ethical,
Cool,
ecological implications, and it's sort of loosely coupled with the conference. So with
cool.
Dorothy, We're gonna run this special issue in JAIS to explore all these different ethics, social, sustainability consideration about digital responsibility, and the deadline will be November, so that people that they can go to the conference, they can submit an early version, get some feedback. They don't have to, right? There's no formal connection. It's not a fast track, but the idea would be that you go to the conference, get a little bit of feedback, and and then hopefully also submit or independently submit to the JIS special issue. Now, the call for paper is already out on the JIS webpage.
So when you say responsibility, you mean right? So sustainability, perhaps, maybe DEI, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, maybe algorithmic bias, maybe future
all
of work stuff, right? Labor replacement,
ESG, yeah, environmental and social governance kind of things. Anything that pertains to responsibility on a corporate level, individual level, or even societal level, right? So trying to really get to this sustainability topic. Most people think of it as environmental, like it's a single stream. Then of course there's a social issues track, but here would be like, okay, let's look at this holistically together. We got a great board.
And where's
it
located in September? Where's the actual
it's in Paderborn, I think. Yeah.
Paderborn? What kind of city is that? I know I've heard of it before, but is it a tourist city or is it?
Every place in Germany is worth visiting.
Is there a castle?
There's probably got to be a castle.
There's no castle.
First of all, there's got to be a castle. Secondly, I'm pretty sure they have their own, locally brewed beer. They usually do.
Yeah. Which is, frankly, Americans are better at brewing beer now because Germans waited. They were sticking to the tradition throughout the 90s and early 2000s, right? That they've been brewing beer for 200 years. So German beer was always better than American beer until like the year 2000, right around there. Then the U.S. leapfrogged Germany in beer making, and now Germany's catching up.
Another one of the untested and unproven Nick hypotheses. They're waiting for young scholars to someone to pick them up and prove him wrong.
That's correct. But here, I do, before we get into the topic of today, Wirtschaftsinformatik, right? That's IS in Germany. What is it? It means economics or something. Wirtschaft.
Well, it's sort of like business informatics, right? So it came out. We talked about this. It came out of applied software engineering, software for business is maybe the best literal translation. And it's sort of a decade later. In parallel, there was also this IS, which came out of management information systems. Information system software to manage a company. Anyway, and they sort of they merged. With this globalization efforts in the late 90s and 2000s, it's the same thing. But originally in Germany, it was an applied informatics and applied software engineering discipline, which is also why you still have a lot of German IS research that looks at constructing and designing and building new software to do certain things. That's just the historical roots here. That's how I would put it. Other people would put it differently, of course. Anyway, you got a topic for today. Let's get into it.
And this is and we brought it up last time, but this is what we're going to do. I went around, talked to some more junior people, and they tell me that they listen to our podcast and they like it and they give me different feedback. Like I always hear, you're the good looking one. It's like, wait a second, I'm a little older, but you're not better looking than me by that much, right? It's what's going to happen is you're going to get fat and bald in the next few years, and then you'll just be another fat, bald old guy like me, and then no one's going to care about our looks, right?
Yeah, true that.
But so what they really want to hear, though, and I asked them, like, what about suggestions? And what anybody cares about, the only thing they seem to care about is how do I get published? Really, that's the name of the game. And we talked about it last time. It's like, we just need to get published. We need to get our papers. Everyone's going to determine our worth by counting our number of papers and by counting our number of papers at good journals, right? So let's do this. We both know that the way you get published is by doing a really good job in research, right? In the end, every paper could get rejected, but even really good papers will get rejected but they'll eventually get into a top journal if you do really good work. You know your method, you have good data, you really do a quality job with your literature review and motivation, and you have a contribution. You will get published eventually, right? So let's not talk about what it takes to get published as far as the
research goes.
Yeah, let's talk about tricks.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Tricks to getting published. What are some of the things, in addition to knowing your method really, really well and being rigorous, knowing the literature really, really well and reviewing it in a generous manner, the things we've talked about in the past, and having a legit contribution. So you have those three things. What are the tricks to getting a revision that first time, to getting published, to like, what would you get? What are tricks? Do you have any?
All right, let's get to this. But before we do, I want to preface two things. So the first one is what you just expressed. I always express as my first golden rule of publishing, in a way, and I always say like good papers build on good research, but you can waste good research but not writing about it well enough.
Yeah.
You know, like you can't turn a shitty research into a brilliant paper. That's impossible.
With writing. Yeah.
With writing, well, you know, if you haven't done good work, then so that makes good research a very clear hygiene factor. Like you need to be at that level. You need to have your methods under control. You need to be rigorous. You need to follow the latest guidelines, not the guidelines from the 80s, whatever your genre is. Yeah, you need to do that. But if you've done that, that's just the bare minimum. Now the question is how you turn that into a great paper. That means now the writing comes on top of this. And if you don't do this well, you know, all your great research won't help you, right? Because that's just a hygiene factor.
And I think there's that misconception. There's that misconception, particularly with technical people, that if I just do a good job, the world will notice and it'll work. Right?
Well, not only this, also it's systemic because our training, most of the training that we offer in PhD courses is method training. It's not writing training. How many publishing courses do you offer to your students? Like as a mandatory course in PhD, that's like, let's talk about how to write. You know, not how to do stats, but how to write about your stats.
So we substitute. So this is actually very important to us here with our PhD program. We're substituting tests. We don't have comprehensive exams. We have written papers. First year written paper, second year written paper. In my class, my first class, they had to write a research paper, and then I gave them feedback on it. So writing is really important, and we realize that. So here at Notre Dame, anyway, writing is in the critical path of your PhD education. If you don't write well, and you don't write well from the beginning, you're not going to proceed in the program, and you're definitely not going to graduate. And that's because of what you're saying is that writing is it. I'm not going to say it's half the battle, but you do great work. No one will know unless you do a good job framing that great work and writing, and you don't undermine yourself. I was just reading a paper that they asked me to review. It literally just came to me. It's an Italian author. I turned down the review, but I saw the abstract. The abstract had grammatical mistakes. I'm like, oh crap! I am not going to read this paper. I knew from the abstract having grammatical mistakes that the paper is just going to be difficult to get through. So I turned down the review. You know,
this is a very good first trick. Like, and not probably as a writer, but as an editor, because this, pisses me off as well. Like these little things matter so much. If I look at paper that looks sloppy, because there's a grammatical mistakes, there's, I don't know, like they got the single and the plural wrong, and I don't know, the spelling is wrong, whatever. These types of things, this to me always means sloppy writing means sloppy thinking. You know, you have a bad first impression. Yeah. And I always get very annoyed because I'm like, man, if you don't care about reading the paper before you send it over, why do you expect me to care when I read it? You know? So this is I don't know, it's a trick, but I think it's a really important detail. Like, you know, perfection, like, you know, academic publishing is not about perfectionism. Perfectionism doesn't help you, you know, but here I think perfectionism before you submit is super important. Find the commas, find the grammatical mistakes, because people, when they read it, they'll notice that. And I think too many are not reading, not many are reading their paper carefully, line by line, before they submit. And what then happens is exactly what you said. I look at the second sentence in the abstract, I find something, and I'm annoyed. Now, the author of the paper now has to do an extra job of, you know, flipping my annoyance around, which makes it super tough for them. So that's an important lesson, I think. Yeah.
I can't tell you. Now, I've been doing this for a number of years, and and you tell me if you have the same experience. The very first sentence in the paper. I can't tell you how often I find a grammatical mistake in the first sentence. And I think the reason is people, you know, that's just flyover. You know, when they've edited the paper 20 times, 30 times, 50 times, whatever. You don't really, I knew what I was saying in the first, you know, opening, and, you know, so it's like you get past you don't read it closely after that. So I can't tell you, have you seen that first sentence grammatical mistakes?
I thought you were going somewhere else with this. The first sentence I always go with is, firms competing in a volatile environment with changing customer preferences, technological advances, and uncertain competitive environments. This is a new challenge.
Blah,
And
blah, blah,
I'm
blah,
like, blah,
blah.
blah, blah. You know what? I've read the same sentence 20 years ago. Apparently, the environment has been unstable for 20 years. Customer preference have always changed. Technology has always been advanced. And competition has always been hard. What the hell is different? Like, get away with this sentence. I hate it. If that's the first sentence of a paper, I'm going to hate the paper already.
Tell me what your paper's. You're saying this, and I was just editing a paper last night that I'm working on. We're doing a revision, and because of the reviewers, we moved a very generic information systems research is always concerned with online
Blah,
communities,
blah, blah,
right?
blah.
We turned that into the first sentence. We had a much better first sentence, but the editorial team is like, lead with, tell us why first. The problem is you got to navigate these reviewers. But you're absolutely right. I think people spend too much time in the intro getting to their point. If you're writing about whatever bots in online communities, bots in online communities should be somewhere in the first sentence, second sentence, right?
Yeah, I agree.
It shouldn't meander too long to get there, right?
I agree.
All right, so grammar. So your first rule was grammar in writing, and that's a trick, and it's a key. You have to learn to be a good writer, or else you're not going to be a good publisher, and you have to hold yourself to a high standard, and you can't let the grammar undermine you.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's ways to check this. I've never actually done this, but I know like Jerry Kane does this, for example, and others. They literally put their papers through Grammarly, or one of these online tools that actually check for grammar. Right. So I've never actually done this. Yeah. You get an editor, you check for Grammarly. One thing I've done a couple of times is use the Hemingway app. Do you know this? Hemingway, my paper or something? Yeah, it's wonderful. It's Joao Vieira. He does a lot of YouTube and sort of online tips for writing. He's the guy. He wrote a very beautiful MISQ paper a couple of years ago. You actually reference this anyway. So he got me onto this. There's an app called the Hemingway app, and it just tries to change your convoluted big sentences into the man was alone in the rain. He died. Yeah. Hemingway writing, which
direct, short sentences. That's the other grammar thing. We end up having passive voice, long sentences, and it's the great writers of the world write beautiful, concise, short sentences. All right, enough about writing. We emphasize that that's very, very, very important. I'll tell you the other trick. Another trick, in addition to data. People don't often think this, but the sexiness of your data.
Yeah.
And this is what makes, and sometimes even if you don't have the best written paper, you don't have the strongest contribution, you don't have whatever, but people see your data, and it's
sexy data is awesome.
It's really hard to get, and it's really interesting. Yeah. So there are a couple of things that make your data sexy. So I did my dissertation on NASA.
Yeah, I
right.
know. Yeah.
I swear NASA got me published, right?
Absolutely.
Because people want to read,
and it should. It's not a, it's not a game. It's not a cheat. It should. It's sexy. It's interesting. People want to know about this. Yeah.
It's Frederick Svan and I think Ola is on that. I don't know who else is on that paper, but back in 2014 or 15, they have this.
They wrote about Volvo.
Volvo. It's like the moment Volvo's in the paper, it's like that's getting in. Right. It might take a few rounds to get a message out of, but if I'm an editor and I get a paper where Volvo, I did a case study in Volvo, and this is what they're doing with their electronics in a car. I'm like, no editor worth crap is going to reject that paper. They'll give you 8 rounds to make sure it's not embarrassing, but so if you can get NASA, if you can get Volvo, if you can have Amazon, if you can have a nice company. We just talked about SAP last time, right? As far as they were looking at inside of SAP, having company data where you're allowed to use the company's name, and it's one of these big household name impressive companies. I think that's a trick that gets you published.
Well, I was chuckling because I wrote down in my notes for today, I wrote down the opposite. I wrote down boring data. And what I meant is the same thing. I said like most have really boring data. And the flip side of that is if you have really sexy, good data, different data, and that can equate to data that is actually hard to get, where you have to go the extra mile of getting that. Yeah. So, for example, I've seen lots of Uber papers based on the data that's publicly available and it's sort of scrapable. I haven't, but there's a few papers where they talk to senior directors at Uber, where they survey all the Uber drivers, like where they get some aspects of Uber, which is an inside look into how Uber operates.
Right.
All of a sudden, this is not boring. This is sexy.
It became sexy.
And I think the trick for that is what you did as well with your NASA study, but also what Frederick did with the Volvo. It's in the title.
Yeah.
The sexiness is already in the title. This is not
Yeah.
you didn't write a post-implementation enterprise system. You usually wrote how NASA did this. It's in the title. And
Yeah.
I've been working on a paper on Apple. Guess what the its title is about? It's about Apple. It's Apple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's sexy
Totally.
because it's Apple.
Yep. So there are two, but here's the other thing. Let's say I do a 5-year ethnography at BMW, right? But they say you can't use our name. So what I do is I write a paper about my 5-year ethnography at a large German automotive company, right? And then it's like, okay, that's still cool. Like if I'm an editor, I still look at that and think, yeah, you did a 5-year ethnography in a company. And I don't care if it's a machine manufacturer that I never heard of or something like that. That's better data than, because it's hard to get. But if you can make the little extra step and use the words BMW, right? If you can spend the extra few months to get the approval from inside the company to submit this paper or whatever, I think that just totally, that's like a degree of magnitude. The data itself is sexy. The ethnography, the rich data set for a big automotive company would be sexy. But the moment you're allowed to use BMW, right, is the moment you've just brought it up from a nice paper that we love and it's still sexy data, but you've made it like the hottest data in the room, right? It's like that beautiful woman walking in and everybody looks at her, right? That's what happens when you are allowed to use BMW in the title,
That's right. Yeah, I agree. So I'm both on the same page here. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
what about when you're not using, so I have the bias. I'll tell you as an editor, I have a total bias that when I have intra firm data, I want to give them a revision. If someone went to a firm and actually did qualitative research in the firm, they went to a firm, did a survey in the firm, they have process traces in or any organization, it could be a hospital, it could be whatever. But the moment they have actual data from inside of an organization, I always give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's because in our field, particularly the quantitative stuff, is all kind of publicly available data sets, as you said, right? So I think the bar is harder for publicly. Now I have open source software papers published and I'm working on them, and that's publicly available data. And I think you can still do great research, but I think the bar is much higher when it's publicly available data. People will, at least I will be more generous to authors if they're doing that hard fought intra organizational data. I don't know. Would you agree with that or not necessarily?
Well, I agree with you, but it's because both you and I, we have this bias towards, firm level and inside the organization. You talk about this, that I always talk about, like, I want to go inside the firm. I want to go into this building and see how they deal with things. So we have a similar bias. So we both like this sort of stuff and we both like it more. Yeah. So for example, I do research on startups with the startups because I don't like writing about startups based on things that I see in TechCrunch. Like in one of these databases. I don't like it. I don't think it's close to the truth or close to the practice. So, but I'm realizing this is just, there's great value in this research as well. And it should be done and it is being done and so forth, but I like the other stuff better, right? So, so I would agree, but only because I have a similar sort of view of what I really like.
Yeah. And really, I know my good buddy over here, Corey Angst, does a lot of stuff in healthcare and econometric kind of healthcare data. And we have a paper actually together that's coming out in JAIS where we use this healthcare data set. And it's kind of interesting because if you look in this world, everyone's using the same data set, right? For healthcare in the US and econometric approaches. And so to get your difference, to the different insight out of the same data set, you have to be a little clever. You have to, right? Because there's this certain healthcare data thing.
Like the healthcare reminds me of a trick that's probably not my trick, but it's a thing that my mentor Michael Roseman, who we had on the show before, that sometimes he pushed a little bit. He always said, like, pick a dependent variable that matters.
I had that on my list.
Yeah, intentionally
I didn't even have
right?
that matters. I actually said dependent variable. Yeah. So it's not so one that matters. Yes. Anyway, go on.
Well, what I meant is, like, can you do research on a topic where the dependent variable is people die less, or more people get healthy, or something that is really, really important, and intention to use is not important, and I don't know, firm performance is a little bit more important, but really isn't, but. Yeah, because you said healthcare. Well, if your research can show that, less people die, yeah, it helps on so many levels. The introduction writes itself. The problematization is a piece of cake. Because if you can say, look, we know a lot of things about why people die, but I add a little bit to it, and a little bit means that 10% less people die. Wonderful. I want to see this. Give me. So
Yeah.
I think this is all connected to what is your dependent variable, and very often the dependent variable is boring. And I'm gonna say something outrageously, which is my biggest problem with marketing as a field. Their dependent variables are willingness to pay, intention to visit, intention to buy, and of course price.
You're being
thingy,
mean,
right? Yeah,
they
I am
have
being
share
mean.
of wallet. The share of
Oh,
wallets are very
great
good.
share
And
of
then there's some
wallet.
other ones,
But all of them, they don't really care about these dependent variables. All of them are about
Well,
getting people to pay more for certain things.
well, that's called business, dude.
That's called marketing.
You can be in your little bubble of academia and not have to actually provide value to anyone in the world, right? But sometimes those people out there busting their hump running businesses maybe do care about maybe generating some cash. Right?
I'm just saying we are in the fortunate position. Well, it comes with pros and cons. So they have well-defined dependent variable, which is good because you can always, it's easier to establish a cumulative tradition. We have the advantage that we can pick, some would say, more exciting, more interesting, more relevant, otherwise differently and important dependent variables that are not willingness to pay and intention to purchase.
So I have two comments on this. The first is, I think you're right that a sexy, we'll call it sexy again, but a compelling dependent variable, you're more likely to get published than not. And then the other thing that I think you gave away with your talk is that if it's some sort of socialist, anti-business, help humanity sort of dependent variable, then academics who are all in their bubble and don't have to worry about business and don't have to worry about will more likely be excited about that.
Of course, all left-wing liberal.
if it's sustainability, if it's helping humans, and so these are all good, they're important. But those types of dependent variables, if you can find them, will move people to want to.
And I also think it's a thing of our time now. Like, this is the room. You see this in our field. I just said, look, we talk about digital responsibility. Yeah, ethical, social, environmental responsibility for your use of IT. Yeah, last year we gave an award for the theory of dignity and care. Yeah. So these are all new dependent variables that have very little direct connotation with classical business things like return on investment, return on assets, sales, profit, revenue. I'm not saying they're not important, but the reality is that, first of all, there is a wider array, and secondly, at the moment, the field and everybody else is interested in that. So if you research, links to these things, you can use that. It's a nice little trick.
Yeah, and in the traditional kind of strategy and operations groups that really had profitability and front right as their key dependent variables, even those groups are kind of really open to more.
Yeah, they're expanding their operationalization of performance to now cover not only financial performance, but let's say also all sorts of other ESG type of performance metrics.
Yeah. ESG is hot. If you're writing a paper right now and you're a dependent variable has to do with ESG, you're good to go, right?
And this is probably a third trick, and a one that you're probably not gonna like, because you just published this paper on clickbaiting research. We had the clickbait episode. There's now a Nick Parenti clickbait research paper with IB and others, I think. Anyway, but the reality is also, if you have a first solid paper on an emergent topic, it's a trick, dude. It's a trick.
It is a trick, and it's a depressing trick.
I'm not advocating it, but it is a true trick. It plays.
Yeah, and actually, if you are going to write the first paper on whatever, I don't even know what the first paper is. Right now, everybody's writing the first paper on metaverse. We've spent the last year writing the first paper on metaverse and I have two of them myself, right? At conferences, and the fact is, everywhere you look, there's a metaverse paper. But
I think there's also a right way of doing it. I think there's a right way of doing this. You remember when we gave an award to Carolina Selch? Yeah. So you could say this is the first paper on bots. It's not the first paper on bots. It's the first really good, solid, empirical, theoretical paper on bots, like a really robust, big paper. It's a big paper, the first big paper on bots. It's not the first paper on bots there is, but I think this is the right way to do it. Like, if you pick a new topic and then you figure out, how do I get a sexy dependent variable? How do I get sexy data on this? Because then you're virtually unrejectable. If you have good data with a good idea on an emerging topic, that's
So
a killer.
that's the key is you need one of two things, right? One is you need to do what Carolina did, which is actually get data and do a real study with a theoretical contribution, right? The other one is even if you don't have data, but you're writing about, don't make it a lame tutorial that's basically a Forbes article with some citations, right? It's just, this is a new, right? That's awful. Actually conceptualize what's different about the technology and drive some theoretical propositions or something from it, right? And that's the problem. That's my problem with half the blockchain papers, right? And there's no real conceptualization of, blockchain is a distributed database, right? Well, anyway, all right. So DV, I agree with you. And there are more compelling DVs and less compelling DVs. Now I'm going to go a step further. When I was thinking DV, I actually wasn't talking about more or less compelling when I wrote it down. I was saying actually have one.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah.
And you don't know how many papers I see where they're just like, especially qualitative. Look, there's this. So even if you don't have a variance-based theory contribution, right? Because I am a big advocate for identifying patterns and just showing us and process theory and process, right? That's all good. But at least have a DV in mind. Have some sort of, and then the other thing that happens with the DV, and this is like the next step in my trick, is identify your conversants very, very thoroughly, right? And what does that mean? That means you write your paper as a letter to the reviewers. Okay, so let's say I'm writing to I don't know, your representation theory or something, right? And I'm writing a paper and I purport to extend representation theory. So that's who you, ABJ, who else is part of that gang? Ron Weber, right? So what I would do is I would write my paper assuming that you guys are my reviewers, either you or your students or your other people, right? And I will cite your work early in the paper so that the editors look at it. When I write the letter to the journal submitting it, I will recommend you as my reviewers if I weren't conflicted with you. I would make it like a letter to you. All right. I think that's the number one trick, is that you actually write your papers to the people who you're engaging. And that does a couple things. It forces you to actually be generous to their conversation. It forces you to actually read their recent stuff and make sure you're moving it forward. And then but here's the other thing. And me as a reviewer and as an editor, when someone cites my work and attends to it fully, I'm only human, right? I read it and I'm like, yeah, they get me. They get it. They like my work. This is good work. And they're really extending. We can't help it. We think, all right, this is cool. If I'm a reviewer and someone's doing a good job reviewing my work, I can't help but like their paper. So that's a little trick you can have when publishing, is
I think it's an important trick.
Letter.
Yeah. So I think you that's a good trick in writing the paper. I think with that goes, and you mentioned this a little bit, is the cover letter. I think what most people do in the cover letter when they make a review suggestion, it's blatantly obvious that they pick friends or friendly reviewer. Obviously not conflicted, but they tend to pick reviewers or suggest reviewers that they think will be easy on them, not the ones that are really the best reviewers for the paper. Because right. I agree with you. If you write a paper about representation theory or anything related to this, even if it's critical of whatever has been said before, you should send it to Ron. To these people that are in the conversation, because they actually like that someone else picks up the discourse and furthers it. Yeah. Yep. So they want to have, so this would be a good idea. And I think most people don't do this because they usually you problematize what's happened, and because you have a different viewpoint. That's the whole point of it, right? And then they say, I'm not going to give it to them. He won't like it because we're criticizing him or her. Well, I think that's the wrong attitude. I would always go like, look, this is really about the work of X. We should send it to X. If I don't have a conflict, send it to them, because I think that's a better strategy, because these people, as you just said, they're actually going to like that someone picks up the same conversation that they're interested in. So by and large, I would like that. I recently got a few papers that are very critical about representation theory and some implications that I wrote about and whatever, and I liked it. It's like, oh sweet, someone thought about it, disagrees. enough to write a paper about it. Well, I actually kind of like this because this is what science is about. So I like this. And, normally when people think, oh, let's not do this because we're critical of him. So he's the least person we would suggest. And I would flip that around, like find the convergence and make sure the paper actually gets to them.
And you know what? In your criticism, don't be dismissive in your criticism. This is a surefire way to get your paper killed, and to get me annoyed, even if it's not written to me or in my research and I'm just an editor or something. And this is what they do. So I'll give you a typical thing they do. Existing research has, explored how open source communities do something, right? To coordinate. But they haven't looked at how they coordinate in this way. Therefore, I will do this. And then they go on that horrible problematization of they haven't done what I did. Therefore, I will ignore all existing research and I'll go in this. No, that's not how you do it. You got to be like, these people have done this. This is what they say. And this is how I can extend it for a particular thing. And just criticizing and dismissing doesn't work. And if you're writing a letter to people, even if those people never review and they never do it, that forces you to be a little bit more, like you mentioned that clickbait thing that I just wrote. I'm arguing with Kale and Varun Grover, two people I admire and respect as much as possible. And we had to be really, we saw that their call for new theories may result in driving clickbait, people just always saying what they're doing is new. So we're saying that a naive reading of their paper could serve as cover for people to say, look, we're doing new theorizing. Therefore, we can ignore all the similar stuff that went in the past and we're doing something new, right? So we're so keep in mind that their paper is not this cover for doing clickbait research. That was the whole purpose of my paper. But I wanted Varun and Kale to read it, right? And they did, and they have a little response. But the whole point is I was writing to Kale, and Kale I know as well as I know anybody, right? In the sense he was a very important mentor to me, or is still but so I'm writing to him. I don't want to misrepresent his thing. I want to, right? So
I have a funny little side story to this, right? So in this same, we're talking about a JIT debate where Kale and Varun, they wrote a paper about theorizing and how important that is and so forth. And then people, they invited, you can write responses to this. So
you have a response too.
Yeah, so let me get to this. So we, with some friends, we also wrote a response basically suggesting an alternative pathway. Instead of, the digital area needs new theorizing, we said, well, maybe not at all. Maybe we just do something different, right? We lay a data and methods platform for other people to theorize. That's our point. So, and they responded to this and it just got out. And, it's fine, right? So it's a conversation, right? We say something, they say something, and we argue with one another. In the response to our response, they have this one little footnote. I just want to make sure that people are aware of this. So they're critical with our response. That's fine. And they have this one footnote where they literally say, well, your arguments in the front ends are really weak. The arguments in the back end are very strong. And it made me chuckle and laugh out loud. It's like, wow, what an interesting footnote. So they couldn't help themselves, but said we like the way that you construct an argument here, but we thought you did a piss poor job here. So anyway, so the point of the story is that's fine, right? Isn't that fine? It's a debate about different viewpoints and intellectual ideas, and you gotta, if you're not happy, if you're not cool with this, then really this is not a good profession, right? So I don't think this is about me, as a person. It's just they had an idea, we had a slightly different idea, and they think the idea has merits or not. That's exactly how it should be.
Yeah. And I actually agree with I agree with their article, and I agree with your article. I agree with them that we can have new theories, and I agree with you that we don't actually need theory. We can be right. I'll tell you the two things I don't want us to have, because I'm very open. Any contribution that's intellectually stimulating, I'm good for. What I don't want us to be is crappy industry research where it's like we're doing analytics that industry does, but we're not doing it as good as they do because we don't have the data they have, right? That's awful. So when you're going without theory, so the thing we can add, if you have data that's less good than industry, well, at least have some good theory and attend to the cumulative tradition. So I don't think we should have that. The other thing we shouldn't have, and this drives me nuts, is some of these really bad Forbes articles. And I say Forbes, or, you could be Wired. I don't know what other online CNET. But we're basically just doing a tutorial. It's a blog. We're doing a tutorial of a new technology. We're saying this thing, and then we do this half-assed review of the thing, and then You
know what's happening right now? While we are talking here, it will be the first submissions on ChatGPT. right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that always happens because we're technology friendly, and it's clickbaity or whatever. So the challenge I think at the moment this year, as every year, will be for the editors to pick out of these many submissions those that are a little bit more like Carolina, like a substantive, thorough, good first study on ChatGPT. Do I want to see that? Absolutely. Do I want to see the 27 research agendas that surround ChatGPT and its applications? No, I don't
Hell
give
no.
a fuck. I don't care. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's the key. If I were to give someone advice on ChatGPT right now, it's like, do a real study, attend to theory, have a contribution, use your data, do something. None of this, I'm going to be the first one in race. I mean, that's so petty. I don't know.
Okay. I have a few more tricks written down here about writing, really just writing. I mean, the first one is a very obvious one, but it's still not being done. And this is gap spotting versus problematization. Like we've been talking about it. We already said it's not even a new thing. And there's every 10 years there's a new editorial about it, how to do it and why it matters and so forth. And still 95% of the papers that I do are just giving me gaps. Yeah. So conversely, if you do problematization in the narrow sense, really what it means, like you find a problem with with like what we know and the assumptions and whatever, or conflicting finding, anything like that. If you find a problem and then your paper addresses that problem, that already puts you in the 5% of more interesting papers, because all the other 95% of them are gaps. Now, I'm not saying here that we need and there's people that say we need this in every paper and they sort of hammer it in. I don't even think so, but I do think that a good problematization does wonders for your papers, wonders also for your contribution. If you do a good problematization, your contribution will be much more easy to identify because you're solving a problem that you explicitly named. You can't, what the contribution of a gap is that you fill the gap. We don't know where that needs filling. But if you say there's a problem with confusion, a problem with inconsistency, a problem with outdated assumption, and then the contribution is always obvious. I'm resolving the inconsistency. I'm updating the assumption. I'm clarifying a confusion. That's really clear contributions. So then reviewers don't have anything to argue about this. You can't say, I don't know whether this contribution is clear. Well, it's right there, right?
Well, and everyone knows the Murray-Davis paper, right? What's interesting. And the whole key to that, what's interesting or that's interesting or whatever the paper is that what you're saying. How do you take it from being lame gap spotting? There's a gap here. That works still sometimes, but it doesn't. But if you can actually say, this is the assumption, and I'm showing how that assumption doesn't hold. The world thinks there are two. There's really one. The world thinks there's one. There's really two. These are Murray Davis's ideas.
Yeah. And you could check for that really easily. I mean, you could go through your paper and search for no one has ever. And if you find that, fix it. yeah. And don't use gap and don't use lacuna, like these fancy terms that people invent for saying there's a gap. Lacuna. There's a lacuna of knowledge. Yeah, I don't care. Like if you find that, you notice that you're gap spotting, turn that down. And of course, it connects to the other advice, because you can only problematize if you know what has been said. And for that, you need to know what the conversation is. That's the only way. Like you need to know what assumptions are there, what findings are there, and whether or not they're inconsistent. And if you don't know that, of course, you can't find a problem with it.
So, and I'll give you the trick to do that. And this was one of mine with Qualitative, how to publish a qualitative paper. And let me just give you an example. Right now, everybody is doing, every paper I get that's qualitative seems to be a digital transformation paper, right? This company is going through a digital transformation. So what does the paper look like? Well, they motivated very generally around digital transformation. And then they do the Goya stuff. And then they come up with 3-4 processes around digital transformation. And then that's their conclusion. And then they submit this paper to MISQ. And I have 3 of these in my inbox at the moment at MISQ, right? So it's like, oh, crap. So, and by the way, I actually don't. I'm just saying for the sake of the storytelling. But so that's what you have. So at this point, maybe the first couple, Robert Gregory in 2015 wrote kind of the first digital transformation paper, right? So he could do that. He can do the big, this is the overall. You can't do that anymore. You have to go in and say something about the digital transformation. I don't know what it is. Every single one of these companies does a digital unit. Well, if you go to look at that Volvo paper we talked about with Frederick Svan, they were talking about the digital unit pretty thoroughly in that paper. So pointing out that create a digital unit is one of your Goya processes, and that's your contribution, that you're unpacking this process of a digital transformation. It's too big. right? That's like at this point, uncovering the process of digital transfer. That my trick, if you're qualitative and you go in and you study it, is that first set of findings that you have, you move the most interesting one to the front. You take the initial back end, the Goya, the crappy little 3-4 processes you come up with that everyone else has come up with, is not the end of your paper. It's the beginning of your research. You move that to the front. Let's say you're studying digital units. You now make it a paper about digital units. And then you read, and actually there's a dozen papers right now. I know this because I'm doing a paper on digital units, but there's a dozen papers that pretty clearly address digital units. These new digital units that are in. So now it's not about digital transformation. It's about the digital units. So now we have to come up with what is the dependent variable or the challenge in digital units based on so you have to make it smaller, smaller, smaller. You don't do it on digital transformation. You do it on individual identity in digital transformation. You do it in certain types of tacit learning in digital, right? You pick a narrow slice of the big phenomenon. And then that's how you get your paper. And that helps you figure out who your conversants are, who those people are you're going to write the letter to. And usually it involves taking that first set of findings, throwing out most of them and moving the most interesting one to the front and writing your paper about that.
All right, I like it. I like it very much, and I think it goes with this general observation that we are in an era where, at the moment, there's an interest for substantive, smaller, deeper theorizing. You don't have to write the big paper on digital transformation. You can write very easy. You can get a paper published on this. What did you just say? Individual identity or something, like one tension in one little aspect of digital transformation of firms. Yeah, so you can deep dive right into this because digital, it's established. Okay, we know this, but we don't know everything about it, and there's an interest for people to dig deeper into certain aspects of it. Yeah, there will be a time when we have grander ambitions or people want more abstract theory, but at the moment it's really substantive. Right? Give you one example. There's this new paper on product meaning making in digital products. This is one tiny little aspect of digital product innovation. What do they all mean, and does the meaning change? Yeah, guess what, it does. So there's an appetite for this at the moment. You can play to this, so you don't have to have this environmental turbulence, blah, grand openings. You can go straight into the conversation saying, like, we're talking about digital transformation, but we're talking about this one aspect that has been overlooked or something.
Yeah, and then what happens when you do identity? Say, look at identity in digital transformation, which I haven't gotten an identity paper yet about digital, but if I've seen other identity papers and other identity and innovation and identity and right, you now have to attend to identity, and there's a rich, big literature in identity, right?
There is, yeah.
And then you'd want to see, okay, what is different in this context? It is anything different in this context? And if it's not, what's the same? So it's not easy. It's just going to be a hell of a lot easier than trying to write the big paper of my new 3 processes of digital. That's not going to work, right?
Yeah, true. So I get some very little things, really operational writing things. So one of them that I always find and I always try to teach with others is qualifiers. I mean, adjectives and adverbs. Yeah. So if you say something is enormously big, or a really risky, or a much improved, or whatever, right? So all of these are qualifiers that you say that something is different in kind, or more or less, or whatever. And I think scan your papers, get rid of these, because the rule is when you use a qualifier, that always implies there's another kind of the same thing that you're trying to separate yourself from, which then means you have to say what's the other kind and how is your whatever you're doing. You have to justify every qualifier, and most of the time we don't actually mean it. If you want to say there's a lot of risk involved, just say there's risk. If you say there's a lot of risk, it implies it could also be a very little risk, and then you have to explain all of that, right? So qualifiers.
I like that. I never thought of that.
No, I do this all the time. Get rid of your qualifiers. And especially conjunctives, sort of like, rich and famous, and, enormous and big. Like these conjunctive with and, where people use 2 qualifiers. It's even worse. Get rid of them, get rid of both, in fact. So that's a little trick, and it sort of is Hemingwaying your paper. It makes it much cleaner, and very often no loss of meaning. You don't lose anything.
So it's similar to this, but what you'll see in a lot of papers is we argue that such and such.
Just take that out.
As a matter of fact, the paper that you guys just put on my lap, that I'll look at this weekend. I just scanned it last night before going to bed, and I see that we argue this, we argue this. We argue is the lead to like every other. Why the hell are we arguing so much? I'm literally going to go through that paper
and get rid of that. Yeah, good point.
Rid of every we argue and just start with the sentence. Those things you don't need, right? These like we argue, so yeah, there's extra words that we add that are unnecessary. Right.
Yeah.
The other thing I don't like is passive voice. And I realize that a lot of people feel like, an academic, it has to be impersonal and therefore,
I had an argument about this with
like
Detmar Straub and David Geffen and others, because they had this, for 30 years they ran this, they had this tutorial online resource for quantitative research, and one of the, like sort of how to do stats and how to do PLS and all these sorts of things. And one of the things they say is use a passive voice because it's in this positivist classic tradition. And I was like, nah, come on, man. I mean, and they wouldn't budge, and they wouldn't, and they sort of, I think now in the updated version of this online resource, it's a little bit qualified. It's sort of like we suggest, or, you might want to, or whatever. But I personally, I think now, like, forget the passive voice, right active. You did stuff. You didn't, the regressions don't show anything. You see something in the regressions, and you, by the way, you computed them, and you constructed
and you did the analysis and
you constructed the data.
Explanation.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I think that's what you do. Right. And in certain genres like ethnography, I mean, the eye is literal, right? It's about you and what you observed and what you saw and what you interpreted and so forth.
Yeah. I think there's like the old people are retiring that still have that kind of passive voice insistence, but every once in a while you see it and everything. And I agree with you. I think just use first person. Now, at the same time, don't be that arrogant I, but don't do it too much, right? Because that's the other problem. Like with we argue this, we argue that, or I argue that you don't, most of the times where you use the word I or we, you actually don't need it. But when you talk about the analysis is when you need it. Everywhere else, just tell the story. Say, this and this and this, right? And you give the story and then say, and so we did this research, or I did this research, and this is what I found. If you use I more than twice in the introduction, you're too concerned with yourself, or we, right? Use it twice in the intro. Any more than that, you're getting a little obsessed with yourself.
All right, we got to get to the end of this, I guess. But, I have one more here that I'm going to put under the word of jargon and concept salad. And what I mean here is very often is that you look through a paper, and even in the abstract on the first page, if the words IoT, blockchain, transformation, and disruptive appear, I'm like, okay, I'm out. So I'm gone. This is just gonna be jargon salad. How the hell are you gonna write a paper about all of these different concepts? So I think there's a tendency for people to use synonyms first of all. Yeah, and elaborate with many examples. But I think in theory, in developing a theoretical contribution, that's the death. You want to be crystal clear, precise, concise, and you can't be possibly about blockchain, IoT, and disruption. These are just fluffy words. So either they have meaning and substance, and then they, you have to attend to all these literatures and all these research on these different things, which usually they don't, or you just get rid of them. Yeah, so it's really clean and pristine.
So then I have, since you want to wrap things up, I have my one last trick to getting a paper published. I want to get one more. Okay, so I have one last one. You have one last one. My one last one is make the paper user-friendly. And there's a trick to making the paper user-friendly, and it fits the other part, the conversants and the everything like that. This is my trick to making it user-friendly. In the lit review, when you've done your lit review, you make a table. And that table defines the key constructs that you're going to use. Now, this is if you're doing qualitative. This is if you're doing quantitative. I don't care what research you're doing. If it's in any way conceptual, if it has variables, if it has constructs, you can define them. So you have a table where you define them, you list the words that are important, you define them, and you have citations. It's where you got the definitions, right? Then you take those same terms and you have a second table in the methods section where you operationalize those terms. If you do a survey, you might have a construct, your items. If you did qualitative, you actually describe how you found each and give examples for where you found each, right? So you have your operation. If you're doing econometrics, right, you show the math of how I came up with this particular variable, right? So you have the table in the front that defined it. table in the middle that
I like it.
that operationalized it, and then table on the back end
Yeah.
that now makes your contribution with them. So you did something where you have some sort of outcome table with.
I like it very much. Yeah, I think it's called the bracketing strategy, right?
It integrates the paper. And especially in the first round. Now, in future rounds, they may say get rid of that table. They may say have a picture instead, which I am actually run into a situation like that, right, where they don't like our table in the back end. They think we should just talk about it and put a picture up, and that's fine. But for getting into the door, having that level of integration, and that forces you to write to those people you're using as your definition. They're going to be your reviewers, right? They're going to so I think it all fits, but it makes it very user friendly. And then me as a reader, 10 years later, when I look at it, I don't have to read your paper. I could look at your table, so your constructs, look at your back end, so your conclusion, and I know what you
absolutely.
wrote. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I know the same tables I use. I like them very much in not necessarily construct. It doesn't always fit, but very often you can find assumptions that are carried forward in the literature. And then in the end, you can always say how your empirical findings update these assumptions. So assumptions, extant cool. assumptions, and then updated assumptions, or how whatever. How you
wait, you said extent. Forward. I have a pro. Now we'll get on to yours, but extent. Europeans love to put the word extent in their papers. They say extant literature.
Yeah. That's probably not even a thing, right? I'm going to look it up what it actually means.
It's a synonym for existing, right?
Yeah, so you go.
The thing is that we native English speakers know that maybe some of you who aren't native English speakers don't, is that extant has a little tiny implication to it that existing doesn't. Or prevailing or other synonyms, right? And the thing to extent is it has this little connotation of it's still surviving.
Yeah, it says here it's still existing, not destroyed or lost. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like it should
something
be
very old that's still existing.
This rare thing that's still around, So although it's still existing is a synonym, it has an implication that doesn't work when you say extant research, unless you're talking about the research from the 1800s that people pay attention to or something like that.
I love it. I'm going to go through all my papers right now and look for the word and replace it. I like it very much.
Put existing or prevailing or current or something, right? These are all fine, but extant has an implication that I think people, and especially Europeans, my European co-authors, all miss. Right?
Okay, I have one more, and it pertains not to writing an original piece, but to revising and responding. So this is going to open up a whole new thing, and maybe we want to talk about how to manage revisions in a separate episode. But just one thing, and that is the response table. And I'm going to call it response slime. Response slime and specificity.
You're not going to say you got to lick their little butts.
True story. So I've been working in consultation with authors. There's one or two people in the author team I haven't worked with before, and we got this revision, and they said, "Okay, great. Let's use my template for responding." I was like, "What?" Okay. So apparently they have this template for responses to any review, and it's basically this set of 30 responses opening to response to reviewer comments, all of which are "Thank you very much for this valuable insight," and all sorts of synonyms for this. And I was like, what the hell? This is so slimy. Don't do that. Not every comment is a valuable new insight, and you don't have to thank everything for 27 comments. Like, don't. It's like.
But doesn't that help you get published? Kissing the ass of these? No, but hey, wait. All right. So first of all, I think it's ugly. It's and
ugly.
I don't want it. But I think it helps you get published, and here's why. I think being really kissing ass to the reviewers, I've seen it so many times. You got to realize these reviewers, who are academics, a big portion of us are crazy egomaniacs, aren't we? And we think we're brilliant, and we think we're right, and we think we're our view of the world. As a matter of fact, the dumbest academics have the strongest view that they're right, right?
Of course.
So when you get a really dumb comment, chances are that person has a huge ego. And by the way, as an aside, the most brilliant academics I've known over the years are incredibly humble, and they're.
Well, it can't be me then, because I'm not humble.
Well, I'll give you an example. Brian Pentland.
Yeah,
he makes you think like you're the smart one. He could put me in his pocket any day of the week as far as intellect, right? But when I talk to him, he makes me feel like I'm the one who knows what I'm talking about. What the hell? So Brian is truly brilliant, and he's so humble, right? those are the brilliant ones. And the dumbass academics that, through whatever formula, have gotten positions of power are convinced that they're brilliant. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you have someone make a really stupid comment, just assume that that person has their ego wrapped up in the comment. And if you tell them that's a stupid ass comment, you have now made them your enemy, and they will dig their heels in to.
Well, there's got to be a better way than saying thank you for the valuable comment. If I'm the reviewer and I get this, I'm like, okay, someone put this generic opening blah because they think my comment is shit. Because if they didn't think my comment is shit, then why would you say thank you for this valuable insight? Like, it doesn't mean anything. It's just an empty phrase. That's how I look at it.
So you know what I do? This is my trick for dealing with a review comment that I disagree with. First of all, if you do agree with it, say thanks. I didn't see that, and particularly in the first couple rounds,
I literally write this. I think thank you. That's a great idea. Or like, that was such a good idea, and we did this.
So if it's a good idea, just do it and say thank you. That's fine. If it's stupid, if it's a bad idea, what I do is I do a two-part response, because I won't do that thank you for this shitty statement, right? I will point out how they're wrong in the first half. I'll say, oh, it seems like and I'll repeat back to them what they say. And then I'll be like, the problem with this comment is it has this assumption or this implication. And then I always use literature. If you're going to argue with someone, you have to point to references. So then I use literature to say, but, here, according to this reference, you're not accurate. That's the first half of my response. Second half of my response is what I call throwing them a bone. And it's like, okay, so you argue with them, show them how that's a stupid statement, you're going to ignore it. However, this did have, we understood that many people might have the same idea, or it did have some, and then we find some value in it, and then we say, so therefore we did this robustness check, or we did this,
exactly. Or for example, you tell it, look, apparently what we wrote can be misconstrued. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. And then you could say, look, so now we put this one sentence, this footnote, this statement, this limitation, whatever, we put it in the paper to make sure that this misinterpretation won't occur.
Yep.
So, and that's it. Like, you responded to you and you actually changed something. Anyway, so the other one is these, very last point, with the response sliminess comes this completely abstract, generic response. This was a valuable comment, so we could substantially bolster our engagement with the literature. Yeah, if I say something, look, you need to engage with the literature. Thank you for this invaluable insight. In our revision, we substantially expanded our engagement with the literature. You didn't tell me anything. You just put out a claim, and I don't see any evidence. So what I always do, I really do this. I say, like, look, here in the paper is where you can see a change I made. So if I say we really expanded the literature review, here's a new table. This has 27 entries. Because now we reviewed all these papers or whatever. Yeah. You can see this on page 10 to 12 in our new background section.
Specific.
We added a new section here, right? Really, with page numbers in the response letters, we can say, look, we hear you, and here is what we did in response. Don't tell me we revised the sections thoroughly. Well, I'm expecting that. Yeah, so be specific and not generic.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. Specific. That works. All right. Did we give a bunch of we have sexy data,
dependent variables,
cool dependent variables, write it as a letter, integrate it.
Hemingway, you're writing.
An effective job with the responses. So I think we're good. I think these are legit tricks. If we think of others, maybe if people out there listening can think of some, send it to us. We'll bring it up.
This is something that we could do. Like in the when we put this out on LinkedIn and Twitter or whatever, then people can respond with their little tricks. That would be really cool, right? That would be really cool. And then we have this beautiful blog of all sorts of really good ideas on how to write. And then maybe, Nick, as I said, maybe we'll do one on how to deal with revisions. I wonder how you deal with revisions, because we probably do it differently. Mm-hmm. How we strategize, how we approach it, whatever. Yeah, anyway, so maybe we'll talk, we'll do a separate episode on this.
Yeah, that sounds cool. All right. Well, this was fun. We went long today, didn't we?
We went long. I could have gone on for longer, actually. That was good fun. I like this.
All right, my brother. I will talk to you.
Talk to you next time.